All right. Hi, everyone. We're moving on to lesson 4 with this video, and we will be analyzing kind of giving an overview. I'll be giving an overview of the influences and factors that led to the growth of the civil rights movement in the 1950s. It's important to recognize that the civil rights movement didn't grow out of nowhere. There were a variety of factors that made it possible during this particular time. One of the first factors historians identify is the mass migration out of the South. This migration makes Black voters an increasingly important part of the Democratic Party coalition. In the South, there were like about 3% basically of folks registered to vote, whereas in the North, there was a higher percentage of Black folks able to vote. And so more and more Black voters means they have more influence on the Democratic Party. On any party, if they were a part of it. It just so happens that more and more began joining the Democratic Party for two reasons. One, Republicans refused to pursue civil rights and after Reconstruction. And so even though Black folks were primarily in the Republican Party, they do leave. And the New Deal attracts more to folks. Even though the New Deal was exclusionary in some respects, as we already discussed in the last video with respect to Social Security for agricultural and domestic workers, the majority of Black workers worked in those two fields. The New Deal did provide enough benefits that Black voters were more persuaded to join the Democratic Party. And so being in the North where many more could vote, they were able to exercise influence over politics in a way they weren't able to in the South after Reconstruction. The second factor that's relevant here is World War II, for a few reasons. The one I want to focus on here deals with the role of Black veterans. If I remember correctly, it's over 1 million Black people who fight in World War II for the United States. And so when they return, just like in World War I, they are going to demand dignity and respect. After World War I, they were often targeted, right? We studied this in the last series, in the last phase of the unit. They were often targeted by white folks for murder and lynching. And it led to some of those, the Red Summer of 1919. After World War II, Black veterans return. They encounter, some violence and repression, but importantly, they catalyze the fight for civil rights. For many, they talk about their experience in a segregated army, fighting for this notion of freedom abroad, right? Especially in the sense of fighting against fascism. World War II was the war in which they were fighting fascism in Italy, Japan, and Germany. Those were the three leading countries who the United States and the Allied powers were fighting against. And with Hitler, incarcerating millions of people in concentration camps, Black folks, Black veterans in particular, come home and they're like, we fought for freedom, but what about our freedom at home? And so this catalyzes the civil rights movement, not just after, but also during the war. There was a campaign known as the Double V campaign during the war to fight for freedom abroad and victory and freedom at home. And this meant political freedom, social freedom, economic freedom. Many World War II veterans also become civil rights leaders, like Hosea Williams, who was on the who fought with King in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, Medgar Evans. There are veterans who become some of the civil rights leaders. So World War II plays a crucial role in catalyzing the civil rights movement in the United States. You'll also notice I have information here about the Tuskegee Airmen. Just like with World War I gave you links to the Harlem Hellfighters, who were honored by France, were disregarded by the United States. The Tuskegee Airmen here are an important group of Black aviators, the first Black aviators in the U.S. Armed Forces. And they served in World War II. You can read more about their successes here. And there's also an interesting article that dispels myths about them. Myths on both sides, myths that they were inferior, myths that they were superior, that they were much better than every single white kind of squadron, and there were myths that they were inferior to every white squadron. The story, of course, is that they were good. They were somewhere in the middle, and so there's these myths that get kind of told about them. In a variety of ways. So I like that article because it kind of just brings us down to earth and kind of is like, here's the information, here's what we know about them. So, there's a mural of them here in Philly. Central used to get a Tuskegee Airmen guy who used to visit every year. I don't think he's continued to visit, but they're an important piece to the story. You can read more about them there. The other background that we've already studied is the history of Black labor organizing. The Sleeping Car Porters, the Tenant Farmers Union, these are groups that fought for economic freedom, and it establishes that economic freedom, fair wages, a piece of the pie, essentially, a fair piece of the pie, essentially, becomes a important piece to the civil rights movement. It's not just about civil rights and political rights, it's also about economic rights. And that's an important piece that often gets overlooked. And that history here makes sure that it's a part of the civil rights movement. There's also a history of Black activism in the courts. The NAACP had, fought successfully against the grandfather clauses. There's also a history of Latino and Chinese activism in the courts, right? Chinese folks filed lawsuits after their towns were attacked during the era of anti-Chinese lynchings. Latino folks also fight for, civil rights, desegregation in the courts as well. So this is important because there's going to be the methodology in the civil rights movement of using the courts as a means to achieve victory. But of course, the civil rights movement is not going to rely entirely on the courts. They use a variety of other methods that we will discuss. Important to understanding where leaders came from, not just from the World War II veterans, but also historically Black colleges and universities become sites for building political and race consciousness. Carter G. Woodson, we read him back at the beginning of the year in 1930s. He's pushing for HBCUs to, move away from their assimilationist politics. And so many civil rights leaders come from HBCUs. Dr. King, Ella Baker, a lot of the leaders of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee are from HBCUs. So this is an important part of the story and factor influencing the rise of civil rights leaders. Black churches are another site of gathering and organizing and building political consciousness. These were the sites of much of the organizing during the civil rights movement. And of course, these are the legacies of the Reconstruction. Let's remind ourselves that HBCUs and Black churches, many of these grew, not just, so while there were some during the era of slavery, there's a surge in both of these institutions during Reconstruction. And the final factor here is decolonization of the Third World. African and Asian countries fought for independence from European imperialism, and they won. And this inspired Black communities in the U.S. They're like, well, if our, if folks are fighting for freedom abroad, we can do it here. Some frameworks that we're going to use. I mentioned this in the opening video. I'm just going to remind us here, right? We're talking about the integrationism and separatism or nationalism visions for Black liberation. Integrationism would be, desegregating schools, achieving voting rights, right? Becoming part of the fabric of American society in a way that's fully respected and fully equal. I list some folks who did that, right? Radical Reconstruction was about that in many ways. Frederick Douglass, Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, the NAACP. King is kind of the pinnacle of integrationism. Great, and Ellen Baker, who we'll talk extensively about and read about, also an lesser told leader of the civil rights movement. We see separatism early on in the Great Dismal Swamp, right? So enslaved people escape and go to the swamps to live separate from white society, while others escape to the northern cities to live, within a white city. And that would be more of an integrationist form of escape. But we see the separatism, the choice choice within a constrained system, but we see separatism, which is not the same as segregation. I think we talked about that with the Savannah Colloquy, that Black folks would sometimes choose separatism for safety. And Malcolm X had a vision of separatism, which we will talk about later on. Visions for Black liberation, it's not just social, civil rights, political freedoms like voting and desegregation, it's also economic freedom too, and we'll address that in this unit. Dr. Kennedy's framework, segregationism, assimilationism, anti-racism, I don't need to say much more about that. We'll apply that throughout. Continuity and change, we will pay attention to that and have probably a seminar-style Zoom discussion about that towards the end of the unit. And then a power and violence analysis. Remember Unit 1, understanding how institutional power can lead to structural violence. Remember our 1967, which is relevant now with the Civil Rights Movement, story of Black students in Philadelphia who fight for Black studies, right? Because the neglect of not having Black representation in their history and courses was a form of structural violence. They fought back with a walkout. They got coercive violence and physical violence used against them by the police. But institutional power can choose to make changes, and they did. They created Black studies, hired Black folks to create Black studies curriculum, sent it to the schools. It wasn't a mandatory class until recently, 2005. So anyway, that's just a reminder that we will pay attention to this dynamic of power and violence throughout the Civil Rights Movement as well. So that's the factors influencing the growth of the Civil Rights Movement and some of the frameworks we'll be using. Next lesson, we'll focus on Brown v. Board of Education. Again, continue to take care of yourselves during this pandemic, establish routine, be kind to yourselves, try something new,